Okay, had a lovely continental breakfast at the Holiday Inn. So this is about my speaking level for the talk, so hopefully that'll be okay. Just keep talking? Okay, great, yeah. Happy to be here, happy to do mic checks. Very exciting. I'll keep talking. How's that working? I told where I did have eggs and potatoes, and then for the first time in probably 20 years, a small bowl of Fruit Loops. So, yeah. You need a little bit of a sugar high to do talks like this. It's okay.
How's that sound? Yeah, that sounded good. All right, cool. We'll adjust the room as we go. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone thought about that.
Do you have access to a bottle of water for
Yeah.
All right, I'm standing. Gonna call us to order. Great to see you all. Nice to see so many folks in the room. I'm Christine Lebusky. I think a lot of you know me. I'm a member of the faculty in STS. I'm also an anthropologist. I'm also in WGS, which is going to matter today. I want to have you help me welcome Jim. Jim Malazita, who's joining us today, is an associate professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where he splits his time between STS and games and simulation arts and sciences. Jim teaches both seminar-style and studio courses at the undergraduate and graduate levels. In the past few semesters, he's taught undergraduate courses on using ethnography in game design and industrial design practice, and graduate courses on interpretive methods, foundations, and futures of game studies, and on synthesizing feminist and queer theories of the body within game production. Since 2017, he's served as an advisor to over 15 PhD students in the departments of STS, games, and communication. Students that he's mentored have won fellowships from the NSF, from the American Philosophical Association, and from the D. Kim Foundation for East Asian Studies. And his graduated advisees have gone on to positions at Yale and New York Institute of Technology, UT Austin, and NYU. The book project on which he's currently working examines the role of game engine companies in late capitalism, particularly as they shift from software companies to platform companies, and how their entanglement with hardware and the legal system is shaping the future of the web. He is also working on collaborative projects about representations of Black home life in interactive media and the political ideologies embedded in alt programming communities. I need new glasses. Becoming very obvious to me through reading this. But Jim's first book, however, is the one that we're going to hear more about today. It's entitled Enacting Platforms, Feminist Technoscience and the Unreal Engine, and it explores the intersections of race and gender in game engines, and is available from MIT Press, both for purchase and, very excitingly, also as an open access text. So please help me to extend a warm welcome to Jim Malazita.
All right, thank you everyone. Thank you so much to the STS department at Virginia Tech for having me. Thank you so much for joining me today. A nice audience for a Friday afternoon in October, so this is actually really great and really exciting. So as Christine mentioned, this talk draws from sections in this book, Enacting Platforms, Feminist Technoscience, and Unreal Engine. The QR code here takes you to the free version of it on MIT's Press's website. Which is an analysis of the game engine Unreal through feminist, race, and queer theories of technology and media, and a critique of the platform studies framework itself, which was really fun to do, given that this is published through the platform studies series at MIT. So it was really kind of the editors to kind of allow me to dig at them while also publishing my book. So thank you to Ian Bogost and Nick Montfort for not just shutting down the whole book project. So the talk today I'm going to talk about is an analysis of the Unreal Engine. The Unreal Engine is a game engine, or a software platform used to streamline the development and publishing of digital games, and one of the most popular game engines commercially available today. Game engines are complex arrangements of software that streamline digital game development processes. Some engines, like Twine or RPG Maker, are genre-specific authorship tools that, while flexible and extendable, are designed to produce the modal outcomes of their genre, platonic ideals of interactive text-based narrative and role-playing games, respectively, for those two. Other engines, such as Unreal and its major competitor Unity, are massive arrangements of code bases, tool sets, plugins, corporate support networks, all designed to be flexible and reconfigurable. These engines' technical capacities include top-level game development tools like graphics processing and rendering, artificial agent and behavioral scripting, and physics simulation processing, as well as lower-level computational resource management systems such as multi-core threading controls, memory management, and multi-platform publishing. These engines are capable of being used to produce not only two-dimensional or three-dimensional games across multiple genres, but are also being used in the fields of architecture, product design, data visualization, and military and urban simulation, among others. Beyond its use in games, Unreal is at the vanguard of a multiple industry-wide incorporation of gaming technology. Its real-time graphics capacities have been used for post-processed video, as seen here, as well as superimposed on live video, such as Fox Sports' giant mixed reality panther that pounces around the Carolina Panthers Stadium during broadcasts. Unreal has also been used for virtual production and in-camera effects, such as the Weather Channel's Hurricane broadcast, and live set replacement for Disney's The Mandalorian streaming show. Unreal's capacity for data integration and real-time simulation have seen the engine used for physics simulations and for military training purposes. The Unreal Engine, like many contemporary game development software packages, must be understood as more than just a tool for game creation. Game engines are part of an ongoing digital platformization of everyday life. Unreal also occupies a unique position in gaming history, both as an engine and as an integrated platform. Unreal has drastically changed in form from its design in 1994 through today, and remains one of, if not the only, commercially successful and popularly used game engines that span nearly the entirety of the modern PC and console-based gaming history. Unreal began development in 1994 by programmer and designer Tim Sweeney, pictured here in the Nike shirt, looking very cocky, building upon and collecting prior rapid game development packages scripted by Sweeney and his company Epic Mega Games, as it was known in the early 1990s. The engine was formally released to the public in 1998 alongside the PC game Unreal, for which the engine is named. Those select companies had licensed elements of the engine for development in their own games as early as 1996. Though the early version of Unreal, the engine, was essentially a genre-bound engine, particularly good at making first-person shooters, like we see here in the original Unreal game, its memory management, collision detection, and character animation tools, all really important parts of developing 3D games, were good enough and accessible enough to be used for an array of three-dimensional game development projects. Later versions of the Unreal Engine, although it's always being updated, were majorly released in 2002, 2004, 2012, and 2021, although the programming logics of the engine are still heavily influenced by gameplay standards and aesthetic traditions of the first-person shooter genre from the 1990s. As such, I argue that to study Unreal is to undertake a kind of living media archaeology. Unreal exists as a strata of digital culture that expresses affordances, constraints, and qualities from across multiple eras of digital gaming. Unreal is still owned by Tim Sweeney through his now renamed privately controlled company Epic Games, whose multiple divisions include the Unreal Engine development, game development, most often using the Unreal Engine, the Epic Games Store, which is their consumer-facing platform, and customer support and corporate relations wings. Epic experienced several monetary windfalls in the 2010s. In 2012, Epic received an infusion of $330 million from selling 48% of its capital shares to Tencent, a Chinese internet technology conglomerate, a sale which doubled as a market entry into China, as well as an embrace of the games as a service model, where games are designed to continually generate revenue after their initial, sometimes even free, point of purchase. The GAAS model also led to Epic's second cash infusion from the commercial success of its game Fortnite, which was both developed using and contributes to new functionality to the Unreal Engine. From a game studies perspective, its breadth and scope make the Unreal Engine a complicated figure to pin down. One approach might be to deploy the lens of platform studies. Platform studies within game studies, there's actually multiple fields called platform studies that sometimes interact and sometimes don't, is a part of the, quote, material turn in game studies and affords an interpretive deep dive into the technical aspects of media, generally through reading the features and constraints of digital media creative software that platform studies authors will often argue influence the design decisions made through those softwares. Such a lens could highlight Unreal's changing material nature over time, as well as how game designers and users have played with and against Unreal's constraints to develop creative media. However, given Unreal's multiple stakeholders, its infrastructural arrangements, and its political and economic importance, to think of Unreal as a system of media affordances and constraints, I argue, feels shallow. Game engines are multiple. In one way, they exist as collections of subsystems, graphics rendering systems, physics simulators, networking tools, compilers, bound together by the engine's interface. But moreover, they are positionally multiple, in that one's subject position within the game development pipeline creates vastly different experiences and understandings of the engine and its associated infrastructure. Science and technology studies scholar John Law has called these kinds of objects assemblages singularities, single objects made through the coming together and adhering of multiple versions, interpretations, components, and stories. In his book detailing the TSR-2 British reconnaissance aircraft, Law describes the challenges as analysts of writing about singularities. So Law writes, quote, "An aircraft, yes, is an object, but it also reveals multiplicity, for instance, in wing shape, speed, military roles, and political attributes. John Law, I am saying then that an object such as an aircraft, a quote, individual and specific aircraft, comes in different versions. It has no single center, it is multiple. And yet, these various versions also interfere with one another and shuffle themselves together to make a single aircraft," end quote. The analyst's or scholar's job, according to Law, is to understand this fractional coherence, or the, quote, drawing of things together without centering them. Fractional coherence demands we understand how an object emerges and becomes stable out of multiple and at times incommensurable parts, objects, and stories. This endeavor is also a recursive one, right? The stories that we as scholars tell about singularities contribute to and interfere with those objects themselves. We are entangled always with our research objects. As we shape these objects, they in turn shape our analysis. Our gazes turn to follow similar analytical grooves and patterns, further stabilizing particular ways of drawing together these fractured objects. So like Law's aircraft, in this book I argue that game engines too are singularities. They are held together and made coherent as much by the stories we tell about them as by technology, politics, or commerce. Much of the writing before this on game engines has read them as collections of tools whose impacts can at times be felt playing the games developed on them. And this implicit logic of tools that kind of influence what creators are doing coincide neatly with the classical formulation of platform studies, which you can kind of see on this slide, which is a bottom-up layered approach of media ontology in which every layer is dependent upon the layer beneath it. So hardware and software affordances deeply shape media content. We can also see why companies like Epic might prefer a narrative like this layered ontology because it posits that a game's potential is at least partially based upon the engine used to produce it, which means buying the correct engine is one of the most important choices that a game company can make when determining profitability, therefore profiting both the company and Epic. The stories that we tell about engines aren't necessarily wrong, but they do include an inherent positionality. As feminist science studies scholar Sandra Harding has argued, an observer's subject position shapes the object of study. Capital, for example, is a major situator of the materiality of game engines. For major studios and well-funded projects, a game engine is as malleable as the game to be produced, meaning game engines and a game and engine are always trapped within a recursive loop and relationship. This recursion is doubly evident in a product like the Unreal Engine due to Epic's unique role in the games industry as both a commercial engine developer and as a games developer. So they're making both software and content. For smaller designers or independent designers or students who are using the engine, the grain of an engine, like the grain of wood, must be selected for, i.e. the choice of an engine that you're using to build a game depends upon the type of game you want to make and what engine best affords that style of gameplay, or as a grain to be resisted. For larger developers, this grain must be accounted for in design, both to account for material and structural constraints, as well as to produce desired gameplay. In other words, the grain of the engine, right, what we think of in terms of the qualities and affordances of that engine, is at least in part determined by the imagined game or interactive scenario to be produced through that engine, right? So the future is always present when building and using these types of engines. The layers model articulated by platform studies here, I argue, captures only one small slice in the game development pipeline. That moment happens when engine developers have settled on features needed for their desired experience, but right before that experience demands new and unexpected features, thus resulting in changes to the engine. And while platform studies analyses, like many of the works produced through the Platform Studies MIT series, have done considerable and really wonderful work in advancing our capacities to interrogate and interpret the more technical layers of digital texts, the method has also been criticized by feminist and critical race scholars as artificially bracketing out the embodied and structured conditions of the digital, thereby risking a fetishization or concretization of the technical apparatus. Our position to game engines is more than just our relation to infrastructures and capital. It is also part of the broader co-production of race, gender, epistemology, and identity. As such, an analysis of the Unreal Engine, I argue, must do two things. First, it must deal with the engine as a fractional coherence, right? An ever-extended set of materials, texts, culture, and knowledge, and yes, games, that cohere together to produce different alignments and productions of the engine. There is no Unreal Engine to study. Rather, Unreal is multiply enacted, hence the title of the book. It becomes configured and reconfigured over time through material practices, discursive utterances, and infrastructural entanglements. Second, understanding Unreal as an enacted object means our analysis must always be grounded in an interrogation of systems of power. Where we stand in analyzing the engine and who we stand with is a part of analyzing Unreal. And so to do this in the book, I argue for a need to synthesize platform studies with the work of those who are in its best position to critique it, writers in intersectional feminist technoscience studies. Feminist technoscience studies has long questioned the bracketing of identity, culture, and power from the analysis of scientific and technological systems. This has included not only a push to further examine the identities of scientific practitioners and those of their subjects, but also for broader calls of complicating and blurring the lines between the cultural and the technical. And for an analysis that stays with, rather than attempts to resolve, the uncomfortable tensions that come from acknowledging one's partial and situated being within the world. Drawing upon Anne-Marie Moll's theories of enactment, feminist technoscience studies also acknowledge flexibility and fluidity, that our world is ever shaped by our own practices within and through it. So this book leverages intersectional feminist technoscience studies to extend platform studies, showing how the Unreal Engine enacts configurations of epistemology, agency, gender, and race, and how they all come to be as relational, multiple, fluid, and more or less unordered provisional practices. So in this book, I take kind of a half historical and half discursive look at different phases and components of Unreal, right? And I myself am a part of determining what those phases are. So I trace Unreal's early history, where I argue that its connection with the US military and the US Office of Naval Affairs not only almost made the Unreal Engine the official game engine of the United States government back in the early 2000s, but was also an important part of producing the game America's Army, which not only produced understandings of the ideal soldier, but also produced understandings of gendered conflict, right? Where men and women belong, what it means to be present within the military. I also argue in a chapter called Orienting Z, that as Unreal and game engines in general begin moving into broader fields beyond games, certain ludic interfaces, so play interfaces, are now changing what it means to spatially and embodiedly relate to the labor within those conditions. So I trace, for example, the difference between understanding what one's work is as looking through a screen, as you would in animation, versus looking over blueprints as you would an architect, right? And the literal embodiment of staring forward versus staring down, and how that impacts how our bodies interact with Unreal through its visual and its interactive systems. I also borrow from queer and feminist literary scholarship to try to understand how looking at Unreal as always an ongoing set of practices challenges our notions of performative and literary agency of characters, and how we can trace characters like, in this chapter, Elizabeth, a key character from Bioshock Infinite, a prestige, although I'll use scare quotes there, prestige text from the mid-2000s, and how understanding Elizabeth's character requires a feminist analysis of both the narrative and the underlying technical systems that allow her to exist. But today what I'm going to focus on is pulling from two separate chapters, each of which form an arc in the book that I call white photorealism. So in white photorealism is a term I use to describe a legacy of the alignment of white ways of seeing with claims to truth and reality. These ways of seeing are not just aesthetic, but as I'll trace through the talk today, technical and scientific as well. And I'm going to start the story today with a tracing of what's called Unreal's physically based materials rendering system. We'll start a little technical, but then we'll move beyond that pretty quickly, which is responsible for the underlying algorithms that calculate light and color for display on a video screen. I'll then connect this in the second part of the talk to longer raced histories of physics, painting, and photography and film to highlight how technologies and techniques of rendering in Unreal remediate these histories in ways that privilege both capturing white bodies and also centering white bodies as a universal for which all other bodies are derivations, right? So again, this kind of centering is the white body and the white subject as the universal rational subject. So let me do a really quick technical dive, and then I'll pull out a little bit more, hopefully in a bit more fun. So Unreal's physically based materials are part of a larger push towards physically based rendering, or PBR. So if you hear me say PBR, I'm talking about this, not the beer, for the rest of the talk, in the games and animation industries. We can characterize PBR as a broad set of techniques and approaches to computer graphics that attempts to reverse engineer the physical properties of light and color to develop, and this is important, a standardized and systematized approach to rendering. Much of this reverse engineering focuses on simulated physical properties of objects as represented by shader algorithms, whether or not an object is metal, how rough its surface is, and whether it absorbs or refracts light. PBR derives its name from this simulated physicality. Despite the push for standardization, though, and this is probably a familiar story no matter what field of part of STS you're in, there actually is no standard PBR formula or implementation across software packages. Unreal's models themselves are based upon models developed at Disney for the 2012 film Wreck-It Ralph. However, most PBR models, including Unreal's, center two core physical models of how light and surface interact. The first is microfacet theory, and the second is the conservation of energy. Microfacet theory, shown here, abstracts the interaction of a ray of light with the surface and subsurface of an object. So light is modeled as a carrier of information. Human vision then interprets the color of light due to the angle that light takes to the eye, right? What it bounces off of and then comes to the eye, as well as the qualities of the surface that light has bounced off of. So microfacet theory posits that when rays of light hit a surface, their resulting directions are determined first by how light penetrates the surface membrane and bounces around inside the object and exits the object, a process, depending on which engine you're working with, is either called subsurface scattering or diffusion. If you want to see an example of subsurface scattering, and actually what I'll talk about later, if you hold your hand up to a light, like the webbed parts of your hand, so like this kind of light layer of skin in between the thumb or in between your fingers, aren't quite blocking the light, but they're also not letting all the light through. It's kind of bouncing and almost looks like it's glowing on the inside. You can also see it when someone's lit from behind and it looks like their ears are glowing. This is subsurface scattering, right? Its light is entering and bouncing around, and it's not just an organic material that does it. All material, almost, will have some form of subsurface scattering built into it. So subsurface scattering is one part, and also microfacets, which are kind of shown here, which are microscopic ridges, deformations, and divots in the surface of an object that deflects light rays. Diffusion contributes to an object's perceived color, while microfacets of a surface alter an object's reflectivity. The rougher the surface of an object is, the more it disrupts the uniform patterns of light and the less image information is retained. The smoother, in other words, the smoother an object's surface, the more reflective the object. Now, importantly, this is a model, right? It's aligned with different ways of how we can study and understand light, but at the end of the day, it's a shortcut model because when you're building game engines, you have to render the images on the screen at least 30 frames per second so that the human eye can pick up that motion, which means you have to take a lot of shortcuts in order to render large, detailed images that quickly and that rapidly, right? Especially for when we start getting into games that are being rendered 60 or 120 times every second, right? So we're always using these models to approximate physicality, and it's that connection between approximation and claims to truth that I'll be getting into a bit in this talk. The second, this is the last technical slide, then I'll move on. The second important part of PBR is what's called the conservation of energy model. The conservation of energy model in computer graphics, right, which is itself a simplified version of the conservation of energy model from physics, right? So there's this really interesting aesthetic and technical connections with scientific fields. Splits the material world into a binary of conductive versus insulating materials. Conductive materials, which are almost universally metal, have high reflective values and tend to not scatter light, thus offering no diffuse color. So in the world of PBR, metals do not have subsurface scattering because they're conductors. Insulators, like most nonmetals, will generally scatter some light and therefore offer a brighter diffuse color. Reflectivity also changes depending on conductivity because it's all electricity and energy being piped around, with metals sometimes tinting the color of their reflections. In PBR, most important thing for this talk, and then I'll move on, this binary is translated into a property within the engine called metalness, which is a metalness channel for shaders. The value that PBR artists assign, and it's binary, metal or non-metal, fundamentally changes the physics calculation of a material. So no matter what else you're doing in a PBR model, whether that's in Unreal or Unity or at Disney, you are fundamentally deciding this model for metal, this model for non-metal, based upon conductivity and insulation. There is no in-between. You can technically make an in-between, but no one wants to do it. But technically, yes, for most practice, it is a binary model. OK, so let me get to the more fun stuff. So in the first chapter of these two sections, talking about white photorealism, I argue that PBR is a successful graphics technology, not only because it makes pretty good-looking images, but mostly because of its alignment with whiteness. First, from an aesthetic perspective, the shading techniques modeling of photoreality is not necessarily aligned with physical reality, right? The photo component of photorealism is actually really important, but rather that of white Hollywood cinematic photorealism as defined and institutionalized by the graphics production house Industrial Light and Magic through the 1980s and the early 2000s. So this is George Lucas, Dennis Muren, Terminator 2, the Star Wars movies, right? ILM is a major producer still is a major producer of graphics, but a major influencer of what looks right on the screen when it comes to visual effects. As film theorist Julie Turnock has documented, ILM's photoreal, quote, house style was a synthesis of George Lucas's desire to blend mundane lighting and camera effects with fantastical effects, along with producer Dennis Muren's eyeball test. And the eyeball test was cinematic realism was best achieved through the eye of the director, who could judge whether or not a shot would look right to the audience, right? So when we're building these types of graphics, physically accurately simulating reality doesn't matter as much as what looks and feels right to the director of the film or the game. ILM's cinematic success and commercial popularity would influence the industry writ large, leading towards effects houses aiming to replicate ILM's style and computer graphics technologies developed in directions that are technically and artistically aligned with ILM. Thus, not only did ILM's particular photorealistic style become broadly naturalized, so assumed by industry and general audiences to be the result of a natural progression of technology and cinematic technique, so too did the practices of ILM's art directors. The presumption that a well-trained directorial eye had the capacity to objectively evaluate the realness of a scene. Second, from a labor perspective, I argue that PBR aligns itself with what Chandna Prasad Weinstein has called white empiricism of scientific practice, or the combination of an assumed objectivity and field prestige that occurs in whitened spaces in the scientific community. PBR's aesthetic validity, as determined by interviews that I was doing with game graphic developers, is derived, at least in part, from its rhetorical closeness to physics. That because PBR accurately simulates physical phenomena, its judgment on how an object appears can be valued alongside or even above the artist's eye, right? And so we have this really interesting epistemic combat going on where there's the influence of the artist's eye in what looks right and the influence of, well, the physics says it's right, therefore it's true, right? And physics as a field brings an epistemic prestige to game development. And so PBR's alignment with physics also grants it the cultural and political prestige of that field, that of being, quote, effective, productive, profitable, and exploitable. Due to its quick and effective reproduction of optical physics, or rather a naturalized photoreality of ILM as rendered through physics, PBR is seen as a method of replacing artists with computational systems, or at the very least of automating away the boring parts of game art, right? And so games labors in this really interesting and sad and precarious position right now, where through the standardization of the game's pipeline, we have artists being replaced both by increasing standardization tools like Unreal and Unity, to say nothing else of the advancement of AI, right? And so there's this kind of very interesting challenge to labor in game art right now. Assumptions, intuitions, cinema, scientific publications, and affect all diffract through the apparatus of Unreal's PBR. They enact white ways of knowing and seeing. And though Unreal's PBR is part of a larger production of whiteness, it's also important to note, following Patrick Wolf, how whiteness, like all productions of race, is not an essential quality of a thing, but rather an ongoing historical practice, one of which we must be continually reminded, and that involves multiple, sometimes incompatible qualities. Wendy Chun also reminds us to understand race both in and as technology, right? As something that can be found in and through our technical practices, but also as something that allows us to do things in the world. So far in this talk and in this chapter, I've only traced some of the ways that PBR acts to produce whiteness. The white eye is produced, right, often the white director, the white cinematographer, as both situated and effective, although ultimately correct, judgment of physics in the way a scene looks. Similarly, computer graphics are both a particular stylistic choice that can only be made from some of the highest trained digital artists around the world, like ILM, as well as a natural and inevitable discovery of fundamental truths about the material and optical world, right? So PBR is this interesting, incommensurable blend of both subjective aesthetic judgment and this naturalized technological progression of technology gets better, understanding of physics gets better, PBR is a better way of rendering than we had before, right? So this interesting mix there. The artist is thus both central to the production of computer graphics and also eminently replaceable. Of course, those artists who have found their jobs made replaceable by PBR have tended to be those in environment and non-hero art assets, so who are developing more background art assets, which are often produced by laborers of color in the economic periphery, while jobs held by often white male hero artists and game directors remain safe, right? So we always have to remind ourselves of the broader structural, international, and colonial conditions by which all technological industries, including games, exist within. But the rest of this talk is going to take a bit sharper of a focus on race, and trace another production of whiteness through Unreal. Unreal's PBR renderer and its reverberations throughout the MetaHumans project, which is entangled with raced histories of physics, computational vision, light, and skin. Unreal, as I'm going to trace, thus participates in a mattering of race, both in terms of how racialized logics come to matter in real-time computer graphics, and also in terms of how digital light, skin, and the real interact to produce raced truths as a way of computational seeing. Unreal's MetaHuman projects, you can see a demo of here, like PBR and associated with PBR, is another part of standardizing and mass manufacturing the game development process. So here you can see an artist going through a character developer, and if we get back to another scene, you'll see that this character is being made through combining 3 other characters together, all of whom have different aesthetic racial qualities to them, right? So there's this very interesting work around race in the editor of MetaHumans as well. But I'm also going to be exploring kind of an aesthetic quality of the MetaHuman creator. So Unreal's MetaHuman projects and synthesis of PBR techniques, along with body capturing technologies, I'm going to argue in the rest of this talk, mark the white body as standard and others as deviant. At the same time, Unreal's MetaHumans assumes a universality to the body as an object whose embodied conditions can be easily modified, replaced, and hacked. Just as with the incommensurable whiteness of the director's eye and the physicist's eye then, the metahuman body and its graphical apparatus are bound together by overlapping yet incommensurable aspects of whiteness. That of whiteness as unique and above, and also whiteness as universal. To make this argument, I'll trace the metahuman capturing and rendering of human skin, particularly that of its rendering of white skin, as both an aesthetic and ontological universal, which is made more evident when MetaHumans PBR shaders are used to render darker, black, or melanated skin. This enactment of race, particularly whiteness and blackness, includes the digital phenotypical dimensions of identity representation. However, whiteness and blackness and race in Unreal are both entangled with and transcend these representations of the body. Light and color in game engines are enacted through an entanglement of pre-built code and rendering packages, best practices of knowing and understanding light, and through contemporary and legacy hardware formats that determine what can be calculated, what should be calculated, and what should be displayed. And so white photorealism I'm tracing as enacted through Unreal and the MetaHuman project is thus more than just a graphical issue. It in part produces what kinds of bodies belong in game spaces and what those bodies are capable of. It draws from, and I'll trace in the rest of this talk, a longer cinematic history that has privileged the white eye and white subjectivity and reproduces those privileges in computational systems. As such, white photorealism is a part of a larger arc of the production of racialization and whiteness, which Sarah Ahmed articulates phenomenologically as, quote, an ongoing and unfinished history, which orients bodies in specific directions, affecting how they take up space and what they can do, end quote. And so for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to explore how Unreal's white photorealism is produced with the MetaHuman creator, has both been understood through the white eye in terms of understanding skin as a series of layers, and also how whiteness becomes reproduced through the logics of this system. So first, skin in computer graphics and in a larger body of cinema and science has long been understood through the white eye, through the vivisection of its layers, peeling each one of them back as though they were mineral strata. This layered ontology, where the surface of white skin is seen as pristine, while non-white skin is seen as contaminated or containing a foreign other, is historically threaded throughout the Western cinematic and art practices, particularly when it comes to the interaction of light and specularity with the skin, politically entangling relative shininess of white skin compared to non-white skin. This surface depth is racially replicated in MetaHumans and PBR, both through the attempted slicing and layering of capturing bodies, usually literally using photographic apparatuses to capture and control different bodies. And capturing skin for use in MetaHumans involves vivisecting the skin and light, flattening shine and specularity in order to make non-white skin interoperable with white skin. And second, the MetaHuman body has been the body's been reassembled, whiteness is reproduced in the act of rendering. This is what I'll focus most on for the rest of our time today, in the mathematical calculations of light and its bounces that become translated to the viewer's skin. So I'll quickly bring up at the very end the conservation of energy and microfacet theory. So there'll be a quiz. Black skin becomes produced, I'm going to argue, as flat and gray. And I argue that this flatness is a result of a historical deprivileging of non-white skin that's coded into the shading models themselves of Unreal, along with a practice and production of how game developers and cinematographers feel the games look. Right? So something that I want to trace and really parse out in the remainder of this talk and in the book is that this isn't actually as simple of a story as saying, like, this part of Unreal is racist, right? It's much more complicated than that because it's all a practice, right? It's about both how technological systems and infrastructures and practices and ways of knowing and seeing come together to produce certain patterns. Right? And so this is not a talk saying Unreal Engine is bad and racist, but rather that the practices that are entangled with Unreal tend to produce racialized and often racist outcomes. Right? And so how do we, as game developers, as STS scholars, as critical scholars, think about and interrogate these different types of enactments? Before we move on, I also want to say that this analysis, especially given my own subject position, is inherently fraught, right? And it's important to talk about that. Sarah Ahmed notes the problem of studying whiteness in general and white ways of knowing as concrete objects of study. In so doing, we may produce, quote, a reified whiteness as a fixed category of experience, allowing it to be treated as a monolith, in the singular as an essential something, end quote. Similarly, studying whiteness as a point of reference for blackness, or for the rendering of black skin, risks reinstantiating blackness both as a point of derivation from whiteness and essentializing blackness as well. To say that practices that you're using PBR are poor at rendering non-white skin is to imply a political or embodied universality to blackness as a concept and to non-white persons. Conversely, to say that PBR is poor at rendering melanin, which I'll talk about in a little bit, or melanated skin, one is just incorrect because all skin has melanin. And mealy mouth. Melanated skin is poorly rendered because of its historical entanglements with blackness and non-whiteness and the dominance of white ways of seeing, not because of any objective properties of the chemical itself, right? So as I'm going through this talk, for clarity of the writing and clarity of the speech, I'll often use terms like black or melanated or white where each feels analytically appropriate, while I want to be very, very clear, simultaneously acknowledging here the risks of essentialism and the racialized constructions inherent in the analysis and in my own white male straight eye, right? And so thinking about how I as a subject position, as a researcher, have to both contest like race as a single essential category, while also acknowledging that sometimes we hold things static to do an analysis and that is always fraught, right? So my hope is to leave this talk and to leave this book having contributed in some small way to longer histories of opening up spaces previously rendered technical to critique grounded in an analysis of race and power, and not to have contributed to those forces who seek ever race's interpretive closure, right? And so the thing that we're talking about is always moving and always produced in practice. Okay. So let's look at the MetaHuman project. The future of digital humans, Epic would tell you, is the MetaHuman Creator Project. And this is the kind of first advertising video that Epic put out. This Unreal Engine 5 plugin promises easy integration of pre-rigged, so pre-controllable, lifelike humans into any Unreal developed project. When first downloading and running the Meet the MetaHumans project demo, so you can actually download this video as an Unreal Engine project and play with it, and this was part of my methods for the work, users are presented with a T-posed black woman. Upon running the simulation, you get this video. The in-game camera shifts to a close-up of the woman's face. She smiles and introduces herself with a soft British accent. She says, "I am a metahuman." The skin around her cheeks puffs and swells as she speaks, and her forehead wrinkles and softens as she raises and lowers her eyebrows. As she narrates the strength of the MetaHuman project, she proudly declares that she is fully rigged, and she continues, "With everything, quote, running live on Unreal Engine, my motion works seamlessly," and she suddenly disappears and is replaced by another digital actor who finishes the sentence, "on other characters." The transition in the video is somewhat jarring. This is intentional, of course. The ebbs and flow of the control rig, the close-up of the camera angles, and the sudden character swap are all manicured to provoke a sense of libidinal technological wonder, right? What amazing things the Unreal Engine can do. But there's another reason why the switch is concerning. The second character, rendered as East Asian, stands out literally visually in the video more than the first character, a black woman. At first glance, the sharpness of the transition can be explained by simple color choice. The background of the video is a deep gray, and paler skin tones contrast and pop against that backdrop more than darker ones. But as you look closer at the image, you can see that that pop has less to do with background and more to do with the skin itself. While both characters, frankly, are underlit, they both need a nice, better lighting rig, the second character's skin is more vibrant. Highlights help define the features of this character's face. His midtones and flesh tones are never pushed too far towards white, and his lowlights and shadows don't dissolve into a flattened gray or black tones. If anyone's ever worked in film production before, you know how important it is to light your figures and light your actors really well so that you're both not overexposing them and washing them out, but also not underexposing them and flattening them out on the camera. The diffusion of light just under the surface of his skin gives a slight pinkish undertone, preventing the skin material from looking too flat or kind of painted on. I'm sure many of you have encountered this kind of uncanny valley feeling when you're looking at a digital character and something just feels off, right? The second character looks better. The first character, on the other hand, features blown out highlights on her skin, so we lose definition, they shift towards white. And what highlights there are appear softened and muddled. Her browner midtones are flat, and her lowlights fade to a gray-black, causing her face to lose definition and fade into the background. She has a similar undertone as the second character, but her skin looks more clay-like, almost as if it were pancaked onto the facial rig. She looks flat and she doesn't shine. What I'm going to trace for the remainder of today is this MetaHumans image that emerges through the Unreal Engine's PBR enactment of black skin through the white cinematic apparatus. The Western cinematic apparatus, frankly, has long been anti-black, both materially and ontologically. Materially, it produces black skin as a deviation from white skin and uses black bodies as edge cases for photography, film, narrative, and digitization. Ontologically, the shine of black skin has long been a site of contestation and violence in a white world. As art historian of the Caribbean Krista Thompson argues, the interaction of light and black skin serves as a contemporary central axis for the co-production of 21st century ways of seeing and representing, particularly when seeing and representing the African diaspora. Light for Thompson is doubly deployed. First as a technique used in the 1980s dance halls by Jamaican videographer Jack Soa, whose camera was affixed with a bright, unfiltered top-mounted light, creating a style whose visual texture is harsh and burning bright. And the proliferation of video light in the Caribbean, Thompson argues, contributed to practices of skin bleaching by dance hall participants in Kingston. Quote from Thompson, "This controversial practice in which dance hall participants make their faces and other exposed parts of their bodies lighter and light sensitive through chemical means stems in part from an effort to be more visible to the scope of video and camera, to be rendered legible through videographic technologies and technologies of light." And importantly, this idea of like remaking ourselves in order to be recognizable and to be read by the camera is cross-cultural, right? Anyone who's ever had to do wedding photos or has done stage makeup for film knows that we all practice different ways of becoming made legible to the camera. And that what we look like kind of in the real world does not look the same way as we do in our photoreal world, right? There's these differences that the camera picks up on. So in her analysis, Thompson explores historical and racialized links between Renaissance painting techniques of surfacism and contemporary black arts practices, ranging from Kehinde Wiley's illuminated paintings to bling fashion. Drawing from art historians John Berger and Svetlana Alpers, Thompson describes surfacism, as you can see in this painting here, in Dutch and European portraiture as the combination of painting technique and medium that gives painted surfaces a bright, luminescent quality, which was used to connote wealth, prestige, and commodity status. In addition to the selection of objects painted, which came to include patterned marble floors, furs, and golden and metallic baubles, new attention in this artistic movement was paid to sheen, shine, and glisten. And Alpers argues that, quote, Dutch painters, for the first time in the history of art, attempted to reproduce the optical effect of rays of light hitting surfaces in the objects of their paintings, end quote. The refractions of painted light were further augmented on the surface of the painting itself as artists applied copious amounts of shellac to their canvases to increase their gloss and specularity, right? So throughout the history of art and production, particularly in the West, you see this similar fascination that we were tracing in a technical domain through PBR, right? What is light? How does it bounce? How does it shine? How do we make it represent what we want to represent, whether that's the truth or something political? Importantly, as Alpers notes, shine and specularity in these paintings came to represent commodity status. The more present shine and specularity were, the more wealth and prestige the person held. Notably, Thompson argues, the only surface commonly not painted within this shiny surface style was the white skin of the art patrons themselves. The patrons were represented in a warmer, less harsh, less glossy light, separating their humanity from that of the objects surrounding them. This becomes more fraught in surfaces painting. in that representations of black persons in bodies in surfaces painting were styled in the same techniques of media and shine and glisten as tradable commodities, leading to, quote, the bodies and persons defined as black not only literally circulated in a global economy of commodities, but also were visually depicted as objects through the visual logic of surfacism. The commodified shine and specularity depicted in surfacist art were replicated in the practices of African chattel slavery across Europe in the time in which the skin and mouths of black persons were for sale were lathered in grease to give a commodified, healthy, shiny experience, right? So again, there's deep, painful, horrible, longer histories around what shine means in relation to the white and non-white body and the connection of shininess to commodity. Thompson's articulations of blackness in video light were the start of a longer legacy of the interactions of non-white skin and black skin with the camera lens. So in a really wonderful book, Genevieve Yue analyzes the China girls' film squares, China because of the porcelain whiteness that was supposed to be represented through the skin of the white women who were portrayed there. Images of upper bodies of white women surrounded by blocks of color. These film squares were attached to the beginning of film projection strips and were used in aiding projectionist calibrations of light and color when projecting to a screen. Just as we've seen in PBR, though, despite being deployed as a universal standard of visual measurement, China girl objective skin color is also culturally manipulated. So Yue notes that physicist David McAdam, in his investigations of skin tone in color photography, notes that, quote, optimum reproduction of skin color is not exact reproduction, which is almost unanimously rejected as beefy. That's a real quote. When the print of the highest acceptance is compared with the original subject, it seems quite pale. Proper white skin in photography, then, to the white viewer, needed to appear even whiter on film than it did in the subject's flesh in order for the white audience to perceive it as natural, right? So already there's this interestingness of white film needs to look whiter than white skin in order to appeal white to white folks, right? Really interesting mix of kind of film history and chemical history here. Later lighting techniques of film and chemistry used to produce this whitening of skin have left lasting impressions on the quality of photorealism of black skin. An art historian and cinematic historian, Lorna Roth, has analyzed how diverse, we see this in the second image here, Shirley cards, so these were, again, methods of calibrating light and color in photographs, in the 1990s showed different skin tones also highlight the white-centeredness of the photographic filming apparatus. So in this image here from Kodak on the right part of the screen, 3 women, one white, one black, and one Asian, are pictured standing in front of a gray background. The skin and hair of the white model in the center features all the things you're looking for in photographic dynamic range. Shadows provide depth to her features without losing detail. Highlights and shine are dispersed to give shape to her face and detail her hair while avoiding blowout. And her fill light, a common technique that brightens the back of an actor to pop out the actor from the background, sharpens the silhouette of her hair and shoulders, right? She is lit very well for a photograph. The black model is less fortunate, right? Her underlit hair has lost almost all of her definition, and her skin appears flat. Dull highlights muddle her features, and poor low lighting shift her skin's earthier tones towards gray. There's either no fill light on this actor, or it's improperly used, as her upper silhouette emerges entirely from her bright white blouse, while her arms fade into the background. In an attempt to light her as white, the shine and luster are removed from her skin, right? So again, even in these like pro-diversity Kodak moments from the 1990s, we see that even after a recognition of the importance of lighting and rendering different subject positions and different racialized positions, the white figure still becomes the standard by which lighting constructions are set up. So I said earlier that the 2 core techniques that unified the varied practices of PBR are microfacet theory and the conservation of energy, how light bounces off a surface and how it penetrates and diffuses within a surface, respectively. In their application towards photorealistic rendering, these abstractions of physics, which, if we remember Chandra-Prasad Weinstein, are already themselves entangled with white empiricism of physics itself, becomes further entangled with the white histories and practices of painting, photography, and cinema. Within computer graphics, they enact the phenomena of white photorealism, the interweaving of truth claims with the making invisible of the photographic apparatus, to produce a photoreality that only feels real to the white eye. Our metahumans' varying skin color and quality of look owe themselves, I argue, in part to PBR's white photorealism, right? The practices of how we develop and render these objects. Computer scientist Ted Kim has explored the historical making invisible of black and, in general, melanated skin in computer graphics, which, like photography, have over time come to universally enact the body as the white body, particularly when it comes to the rendering of skin and hair. Among the major technical contributors to this enactment is subsurface scattering, which I talked about earlier, the rendering of diffuse light in skin, which contributes to the translucent quality of certain skin types. As Kim argues, the mathematically difficult, computationally intensive translucency problem, quote unquote, translucency problem of skin, is, quote, only the dominating visual feature in young white skin, and yet has taken up a vast majority of digital skin research over the past 30 years. Reviewing the literature, and this is from Kim, on skin rendering in this context is, quote, a stomach-churning tour of whiteness, end quote. And this is an image from a SIGGRAPH paper that's talking about subsurface scattering and how to highlight and render skin. And Ted and I have worked on some different histories of this. And if you go back in, SIGGRAPH is one of the major computer graphics conferences in the world. If you look at almost every single computer graphics paper, scientific paper on skin and modeling skin, it's all white, literally all white bodies. Kim suggests that one possible solution to this issue, in addition to more research on different skin effects, is the production of more diverse Shirley cards for computer graphics that would give digital artists a better frame of reference for lighting and calculating darker skin. However, the historical and material context of the Shirley cards themselves, as we've seen, we can see how the availability of this wouldn't necessarily have saved our character. First, as we saw in those Shirley cards, the diverse Shirley cards of the 1990s, what counts as an accurate representation of human skin depends on who is providing the card. I doubt, for example, that Kodak producers intentionally underlit and grayed out the black model in their 1996 card. Rather, the color of the model's skin as produced by her skin tone, the lighting in the studio, the camera settings, and the printers and ink, all of which were designed to first replicate white skin, never stood a chance. Importantly, however, this is not to absolve the human element. Before distribution, some producer had to look at that Shirley card and shrug, yeah, that looks about right. Right? So there's always this element of human subjectivity here. This is not and should not just be blamed on a technical apparatus or quirk of the system. This about rightness of black skin as represented in media still pervades photography, to say nothing else of cinema, television, and games. It was evident in Annie Leibowitz's controversial 2020 Vogue photo shoot of gymnast Simone Biles, which left Biles underlit and flattened. This raised a lot of conversation in 2020. And almost worse, it can also be seen in Australian cosmetic company Becca's advertisements of black skin tone friendly foundation, featuring the hand of a white model digitally manipulated to look black. So all of these hands in this advertisement are all white hands that have been photoshopped to look like different colors. Not only did the company choose to not hire black models for their shoot, they also miscolored the manipulated hand, making the palm and the back of the hand's skin tone the same color as it appears for pale white skin, rather than rendering the hand in gradient tones more accommodated to skin with more melanin. Here again, the logics of the appearance of white skin were assumed to be easily portable to other skin tones and skin types. In addition to the white historical conditions of the photographic apparatus, PBR's reliance on white empiricism for its cultural cachet contrasts with the material realities of photographically representing skin. PBR represents the promise of a universal rendering process capable of producing shaders that visibly work across varying lighting conditions, a claim that the human skin is not, my claim, or a claim, that the human skin is not algorithmically universalizable contradicts directly what PBR is trying to achieve, right? So the idea that it is not something that is easy to just universalize and model is contrary to a long history of computer graphics and games. Kim, for example, upon presenting his research for review at a top computer graphics conference, SIGGRAPH, I can just say that now, even got the feedback, I saw this feedback, it was fascinating, that pointing out different skin tones have different rendering needs was itself racist. In arguing that all skin must, by definition, have universal lighting conditions, white skin becomes rendered technical. It is rendered neutral and objective, giving white skin the mathematical prestige of universal skin. Invoking darker skin as having distinct needs thus brings a bias into the world of computer graphics and is thus racist. The correct approach to rendering color for the graphics engineers who reviewed Ted's paper is to remain colorblind. The black and reflective cinematographers and lighting directors have long known about the scare quote neutral white apparatus of the camera's inability to capture darker highlights and shines of darker skin. Cinematographer Bradford Young, for example, argues that black skin is treated in film as analogous to pure black fabrics and surfaces, a material that absorbs any light thrown at it. Attempting to visually light dark skin so that it can be rendered as legible to white skin involves overlighting and blowing out the entire scene. Overlighting leads to washed out flat tones that we can see in the black-led 1990s sitcoms like The Cosby Show and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Young observes, quote, black skin has a very particular level of reflectance and specularity, and here it's actually the opposite. It also reflects light, right? So again, we see that there's not a universal way of interpreting the role of reflectance, of specularity, of shine on skin, but that it's always entangled with historic, aesthetic, and political regimes of visual representation. Like the practices of video light, skip a thing? Like the practices of visual light documented by Thompson, a solution to representing black skin in the white cinematic apparatus is to hack the materiality of that apparatus itself to best capture its specularity. So for example, this does not mean, again, that it is impossible to light non-white skin in compelling and interesting ways, right? It's about the practice, not just the technology. Ava Burkowski, director of photography for Issa Rae's amazing HBO show Insecure, highlights that this hacking occurs across multiple sites. Her own work on Insecure involves applying moisturizer or makeup with reflective minerals onto darker skin actors, equipping the camera lens with a polarizer to lessen harsh reflections, and using bounced light rather than direct lighting rings. This practice that we see in shows like Insecure also highlights that there's actually more interesting ways of playing with the interaction of color and skin than have traditionally been experimented on by white cinematographers because of the things, frankly, that white skin doesn't do. Right? So this like really amazing scene here of Issa Rae in a bar that highlights the use of color both on her face and in the background, right? Blending her in while also highlighting her in this scene, right? Like just really amazing work that can be done when we begin understanding the role that race plays in both the technology and the practice. And although Unreal's PBR inherits the white bias of the cinematic apparatus, its uses, capacities, and ontological positions make it difficult to replicate the shader hacks used to better light darker skin. So this is made even more difficult in game design. Tight control of actor position, camera frame, and spatial configuration allow cinematographers like Burkowski to differently orient light and light multiple skin tones in set pieces while preserving visual coherence, right? So if you've ever been on a cinema screen or a television set or a film set, there's lights everywhere that don't line up with what we would imagine a real life setting to be, right? And they're lighting different actors in the same shot differently. This is hard to do in games where you can't tightly control the frame and the image and the interaction of bodies because the player is in part determining where that frame goes, right? And so even these hacks, which have done amazing things for cinematography, are not directly applicable to games. Diffractions of whiteness are evident in more popular physically based media as well. Gaming communities voiced concern, for example, over the whitewashing of Barrett Wallace, a main character in Final Fantasy VII and one of the only black characters in the Final Fantasy game series, after promotional screenshots shown here on the bottom left of 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake, an Unreal Engine created remaster of 1997's Final Fantasy VII, showed Barrett with noticeably lighter skin. Similar concerns were voiced over Disney 3D animated series Star Wars: The Bad Batch, in which animated clone soldiers based off of Maori actor Tamura Morrison were rendered with pale skin. Though The Bad Batch is pre-rendered animation, remember it still uses the same Disney principled shader from which Unreal shader is derived. In both instances, in both Final Fantasy and Star Wars: The Bad Batch, developers blamed the lighting system rather than the directors. Reddit threads filled with vitriol against, never go on Reddit, against, quote, race baiting, cultural critics consistently pointed to Unreal to justify Barrett's skin tone, arguing that his whitewashing is merely, quote, a trick of the light, end quote, in the in-game engine. Disney, to their credit, did alter the appearance of the clone soldiers in The Bad Batch to better reflect Morrison's appearance, but was also very careful to avoid the use of any body or skin-centered language when they did so. Instead, they identified lighting schema as the cause of audience concerns. As geek culture website IO9 reported, quote, a source familiar with the production of Bad Batch in IO9 told that in the run-up to the premiere this week, changes to the lighting tools utilized by the animation team were made such to moderate their effects in the premiere's starkly lit primary settings. Such tweaks will be made in future episodes of the series. PBR here plays a shifting cultural role in white photorealism. It is at times discussed as a sacrosanct, neutral, objective system of mimesis whose errors are only in the eye of the viewer, quote, a trick of the light from a race-baiting critic. But at other times, it's invoked as a system in progress, an apparatus that's approaching universal truth, but still has, as we all know in STS, unintended consequences. Right? In both cases, PBR is articulated in a way that absolves digital artists and directors from accusations of an anti-black aesthetic bias, or what Imani Perry has called, quote, post-intentional racism. No individual artist lightened or faded metahumans, Barrett's, or clone soldiers' skin, the argument goes. Rather, variables spread throughout the renderer produced paler skin regardless of artist intent. By this argument, whitewashing was a systematic product rather than intentional aesthetic choice. Even still, Disney not seeing the problem in the first place reinforces white photorealism's reliance on good enough when it comes to darker skin. I'll start to wrap up. Beyond light, the current ontologies of matter baked into PBR countermand the material condition of dark skin. The embedded conservation of energy reflectance, the thing earlier, diffusion model fundamental to PBR states that the more specular a surface is, the less diffuse color a surface exhibit. As materials get shinier, they get darker. And remember, as I said earlier, in PBR, in game engines, the world is ontologically split into metals and non-metals. Things are either metal or not. They're either an insulator or a conductor. As most everyday metals, conductors are metals, artist principles shading models use the binary metalness property as a proxy for conductivity. The metalness attribute and its encoding within PBR, however, makes invisible one of the most common everyday conductors that we encounter in the human world: melanin. Melanin, present in all human skin, scare, and the human brain, is one of the only known biological materials that exhibits conductive properties. Its potential use as an energy-efficient conductor in architecture, biomaterials, and green energy is beginning to be explored. Western science has known for some time that melanin contributions impact the diffusion and scattering of non-ultraviolet light. But for all its universality in the human body, melanin's visual properties, and particularly its properties when present in high concentrations that result in skin, have been shockingly understudied. This understudy of the visual effects of melanin, coupled with a general lack of attentiveness to the needs of dark skin, has already contributed to public and embarrassing faux pas by technology companies, including the now infamous green light problem in smartwatches and health trackers, where optical sensors using a green LED light reflectance as measuring for blood flow only work on white and light skin. These same properties, the same inattention, lead to skin simulations that render melanated skin as underspecular and reddened, flattening the diverse amount of skin tones and undertones that are present across humanity. This invisibility of melanin in white photorealism leads artists and developers to treat darker skin as simply darker or dyed white skin, rather than as a surface with unique material and visual needs. This invisibility manifests in the multiple ways that we've seen. Mimetically, darker skin just doesn't look right. Cinematically, lighting practices that can help better represent blackness are either underutilized or discouraged. And ontologically, how skin is built into these engines dismisses one of the most important factors in color and specularity in skin for anyone who's not white. PBR's borrowing of the cultural cachet of physics allows for these political and aesthetic issues to be rendered technical, in that the problem will be assumed to be solved as a universal skin and lighting models advance. Thus, no special attention is paid to darker skin tones. And ironically, one possible technical remedy, the incorporation of melanin's conductivity into skin shaders, is already fraught with technical and political tension. Like the surfacist art projects highlighted by Thompson, ways of representing darker skin are already entangled with representing minerality and commodity. In PBR, as currently constructed, one way to make more melanated skin more electroconductive, more absorbent, and more visible may be to make it more metal-like and more commodifiable, right? So there's also a really complicated political element here. Just to wrap up, it's not all bad. So in this tweet from December 2022, computer graphics artist Jersey Dianagana says, "Friendly reminder that the game Horizon Forbidden West nailed black people, heart." Accompanying his tweet were 6 images Dianagana captured from the PlayStation 5 version of the game, each featuring a well-rendered image of a black digital character. Responses to the thread on Twitter, as always, were mixed, with some commenters celebrating the game's character art direction and mocking the current state of black skin rendering in other contemporary games, like MetaHumans. Others expressed hesitation, noting that the hair rendering in the game was still suspect, with most of the black characters' heads covered with helmets or hats so to not have to render their hairstyles. Among the other respondents was Jan Bart van Beek, the studio and art director of Guerrilla Games, who makes the Horizon Forbidden West series. And he says, "Thanks, Jersey. Horizon's skin shading system used a novel approach where we modeled melatonin and blood distribution in the skin so characters of any ethnicity could have correct skin complexion while also showing emotional effects like anger and blushing." The skin effects in Horizon Forbidden West, developed using not Unreal, but Guerrilla's proprietary engine, still use PBR, right? Again, even though it's not Unreal's PBR, it's a kind of a standardizing practice across engine. But coupled with a skin shader system that imagines skin differently, as a fluid collection of blood and melanin rather than a series of layered strata. The results were striking, and while issues still persist with this model, Horizon demonstrates some of the kinds of work that can be produced with thoughtfulness and care for non-white skin. Replies to Van Beek's explanation tweet also included, as I'm sure we know, typical internet white supremacist trolls arguing that the time spent rendering black skin was the reason Horizon didn't win any Game of the Year awards. Emma Vosson's 2019 quip that gamers, quote, "are still convinced there are only 2 races, white and political," end quote, still rings true. Still, Horizon, Van Beek, and Dianagana remind us that just as race is not an essential quality, but rather an ongoing contested historical practice, so too are PBR and computer graphics, human practices and techniques that are entangled in various and conflicting ways with longer histories. PBR need not forever be aligned with white photorealism. Just as black artists and cinematographers hacked and recreated the camera and cinematic apparatus that was not created for them, so too can computer graphics be made and practiced otherwise. Horizon and Decima play this out with photorealism, offering new types of ways of imagining human bodies that leave more room for multiple kinds of skin. In other parts of the game art community, AM Dark, as you can see on the left slide, curated open source Afro hair library takes a different tack, Rather than embracing photorealistic styles like Horizon does, Dark's library operates indifferently to them, allowing for the production and mixing of the photoreal, the animated, the cartoonish, the low resolution, the alternatively real, to create new kinds of representations and imaginations of blackness in digital spaces. Changes to Epic's MetaHuman creator and to the practice of race and game engines, then, need not be to seek for an ever more ground truth representation of human skin, an epistemological project that both centers whiteness and also would be never ending. It could just be to think of skin and rendering skin as always otherwise. Thank you.
So, okay, we're going to pass the mics. Lee and I are going to pass the mics. And so we'll try to watch for who's asking questions in what order. Please feel free to introduce yourself when you ask your question if you want to, since our speaker is a guest.
I'm Andrew Rosenthal. I'm an undergraduate in STS at Virginia Tech, and my question is, how has the development of ray tracing played a role in how skin is lit and developed?
Yeah, so it's kind of all part of the intersection. So ray tracing, how do I do this very quickly? Traces a ray of light as it bounces around a scene. This is traditionally a highly computationally intensive model for rendering light, which means it's really slow, which means we typically don't use it in real-time rendering like games. Pixar uses it a lot, or traditionally has used it a lot in like pre-rendered footage, right? So there's like, I'm being recorded, so I don't want to give the exact stat, but there's like a famous quote that an individual frame in a Pixar movie takes something like 24 to 48 hours to render, right? So like these are really long productions of time. With new graphical processing units, and that we all know from NVIDIA and cryptocurrency mining and all that stuff, and new advances in algorithms, we're able to incorporate real-time ray tracing a bit more effectively. And video games now are using this technique that, again, is an older technique, but made faster, which means it's made usable. In terms of its interaction with race, it kind of is an additive to what PBR is already doing. So PBR is interesting in that it was always designed anticipating ray tracing. So the models in PBR assume that were first developed, again, around 2012, we're assuming that one day ray tracing will be real-time available, and so built in those kind of expectations. So this bouncing of light, the diffraction of light, the subsurface scattering, those all come from ray tracing logics, and so now we're getting more and more like ray tracing modeled into, I mean, Unreal Engine now does really good ray tracing. From a political aspect, this again remediates that same aesthetic technical tension that we always see in PBR, right? So on the one hand, there's new technology, and technology always progresses linearly and universally, right? Which means it's better at rendering, which means, of course, all the old problems of technology are solved, which we all in this room know is not real, right? And so there's this interesting kind of like, well, maybe for folks who want to admit it, again, in interviews, maybe this type of skin rendering is favoring different types of skin, but once ray tracing comes in, it'll all be fixed. And of course, it's not fixed, right? And there'll be another thing. Well, once we have better HD upscalers, right, that we can use to render new frames, they'll be trained on more diverse models and images, which means they'll fix the, right? And of course, that won't fix it, right? So it's always kind of integrated as a part of this using the technical to dodge the political, or to argue that the political is just a technical problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's very amazing presentations. I kind of have a lot of questions, and I also Anyway, I'm Yan from STS. So, but I'll just ask one question. So, this kind of so your research kind of like show aesthetic regimes built by the PBR, and they have a long histories from the photo shoots and from the white shining sides. It's the first time I learned it, and now it kind of like resonate some of my experience on the social media platform right now, because now a lot of so-called gamer or player community that have been pushing back on this DEI influence a new type of next generation gaming, next generation PC game. So I kind of like wondering, although there's just, you mentioned that there's practice and technology that produce this kind of aesthetic regimes, but is there also, right now, our customers' taste or our general aesthetic value are all working toward this white photorealism or this kind of shining side aesthetic value. So it's hard for the general consumer to accept a new type of aesthetic values, especially in their gaming experience. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a tricky question trying to parse out like what is audience directed versus what is user directed versus what is producer directed. What I can quickly say about that is, I mean this kindly, audiences often don't know what they want, but they know what they want to ask for, right? And so one common thing that you'll hear from gaming audiences, and especially kind of toxic gaming communities, is like the need for better graphics, whatever that might mean, but it's always associated with better computing and faster things and higher resolution, right? So there's this interest in, as games get produced more, or as games evolve, right, graphics will get better and better, and like even weird community things where they'll be like, oh, the sequel to this game reused a model from the first game, like how cheap they are, right? So like this, like always wanting like a personal crafting of the world, while also treating only certain types of personal crafting as legitimate, right? So as we saw in, one of you will know that's not me, the most recent, I think it's an Assassin's Creed game, right, that centers a black samurai, right? Like the entire, which is actually rendered pretty well, all things considered. The entire thing was like, oh, you spent all your time writing a black character in Japan, while also based off an actual person, and making sure they look good instead of like making sure your quests are good, right? So again, there's always this dodging of like, we want more graphics, but not those graphics. And also, who's the we, right? Because that's a very specific audience and loud audience of gamers. And so there's competing aesthetic regimes right now, something that I'm just starting to work on because it just happened. There's another game engine, an open source engine called Godot, although they say Godot, I don't know, like waiting for Godot. It's open source, so they're developing and developed by communities, although again, who has access is always a question in open source communities. And the communities have now splintered and have actually splintered the engine itself, so that now the engine is forked into the regular Godot engine and an anti-woke Godot engine. So like we're again like seeing these like community practices like building, and of course the anti-woke one isn't going to go anywhere, but like it's fascinating to see how similar critiques to the one I'm making are being made in very different and very toxic ways from this like community, right? Of like the focus on this is ruining the engine in some way. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Monami Haynes, and I'm an assistant professor here. That was a great talk, and it made me once again remember why I looked so crappy in my yearbook pictures growing up. But I was wondering if I could ask you a question to speculate a little bit about how this would develop.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about personalized medicine, because in the last, of the sort of the counter narrative to developing different kinds of ways of rendering, you said they modeled blood flow in skin to create, and so that strikes me as yet another standard way of universalizing the human body. And I was wondering to what degree this is like, the future of rendering could once more embed, maybe misleading assumptions about genetics and biology and all of those kinds of things into, what we look like. I figured if they tried to render my skin, they would get my blood flow. Like I would look so good rendered, as opposed to,
Well, it's in the eye of the renderer. So speaking speculatively, I think you're absolutely right, especially as, so my next project is tracing like game engines are no longer game engines, right? They're engines being deployed across various industries. And of course, like we've seen with lots of things that start in the entertainment industry or the ways you make money are aligning with the military, which Unreal has done for a long time, and align with the biomedical industry, right? Like those become huge cash cows. So I would not be shocked if part of the push for, I know the term metaverse is dead, but I'll use it for right now, right? Like this metaverse, not in terms of like Mark Zuckerberg's, we all put on VR and hang out awkwardly together, but like metaverse as a persistent 3D space that is always extracting data and then using that data, right? Which I think what the metaverse actually is. I can see a version of it that is mirroring what's going on in engineering with digital twins, right? Where, well, we don't actually have to be like in the room to see what this technical system is doing, what's going wrong, and why it's going wrong, but actually being, okay, this is another form of medical imagery, right? Where we're using game engines to represent or digital twin a body, which then we can use to diagnose, right? Probably with some AI as well. And so basing medical diagnostic decisions based upon like inherently racialized practices is, I mean, we know how that goes, right? And we know who that impacts. So in that way, although I personally haven't seen, aside from like medical training, which most of those videos actually don't look photorealistic at all, they're kind of intentionally cartoony. I haven't seen a ton of that use yet, but if we follow the rest of cinematic history, like of course these tools will probably be integrated into the longer history of medical imaging.
Matt Wisnowski. So you used in response to one of the questions the notion of fixed, and so I'm curious what, from your point of view, is a situation where this rendering problem is fixed. And I'm guessing before you answer that you're going to say, well, you can't fix anything. So I'll ask it in your language.
It's a good STS
if you were to produce an enactment of this whole rendering process in a way that you think is better and achievable from the existing state of the assemblage, what does it look like?
Yeah, more and better paid Black game developers and artists. You know, I think it's, while there are always things that can be tweaked in the engine or whatever, one of the first times I gave this talk, someone would say, so what game engine should we be using? And I'm like, it's not really, right? It's in the care and attentiveness that's used to using these tools as production methods. Because again, for large companies, the Unreal Engine is unstable. Like a large company can license the engine, go back to Epic and say, this feature that I need isn't in there, build it, right? So if we had like artists and developers and cinematographers and game directors who actually cared and would wield capital in ways that, unfortunately, they could, we actually could get some of the technical issues fixed, but it would require care and attentiveness to rendering as well, right? So again, that subjective, affective dimension of, yeah, this scene looks right? Well, who is making that determination? Who is doing the art direction? Who is helping to model the skin? What models are being used, right? So all that I actually think is more in the human practice than any like technical tweak. And I think it depends on who's in the room and who has the voice.
Hi, I have a question from Zoom. Actually, it's more of a comment, but from Ashley Shu, Associate Professor in STS. She says, my understanding is that people with albinism don't have melanin, complete or partial absence of melanin. Just for the record, not all people have melanin. Sorry, I have to go pick up a kid from school, but this assertion that everyone has melanin is making me itchy. This may be just a side note, but we don't want to write people out of the record here.
Sure, absolutely. And also, melanin is not just in the skin, right? Like it's actually a functional part of our brain as well. And there's multiple types of melanin, but yes, absolutely, right? Like, we should never make these universalizing claims, which I did. Yep. Oh, sorry.
I was curious about your methods throughout this research. Could you just tell us a little bit about what sort of methods you used?
Yeah, I guess you'd call them mixed or multimodal. So it was a combination of studio ethnography, so just hanging out with different folks who are building and using the Unreal Engine to make games. Interviews, both formal and informal, with Unreal Engine different folks who are using the Unreal Engine to make it. I have training in game development, so a lot of it was just literally trying to build things in Unreal and seeing how the system was responding to me. And then a lot of textual and visual analysis. So you'll note that a lot of the historical work that I used in this chapter are secondary sources, right? They're based upon people who, frankly, have better training than I do to analyze like past art historical modes, and so incorporating them into this broader legacy of computer graphics. So yeah, kind of a mixed approach depending on the topic, but generally qualitative and interpretive methods.
Hello, my name's Raphael, and you said Horizon Zero Dawn, Horizon Forbidden West did well with skin color, and I was wondering what they did right and like what models they used to work with that.
Yeah, so the conversation I was tracking on the internet was essentially that the skin tones not only reflected kind of a more deeper dimensionality of skin, like it didn't look flat, it didn't look pancaked, it didn't look patterned on, but also like splotchiness is a good thing, right? Like skin is not like this kind of universal like image, and splotchiness emerges in different ways depending on melanin condition and blood flow. So there was this kind of approach to treating skin as more fluid than solid, right? So that like when we're rendering, it's all about the presence or absence and mixing of fluids under the skin rather than layers of almost like translucencies put on top of one another that are static. So that worked really well for that game. But again, it's not just the technology, it's also the practice, right? Like we could have that technology built into Unreal, but if you don't care about how someone looks, that doesn't mean they'll necessarily look good. So it's always a mix of the tech and the practice.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up there since it's 3 o'clock. So just thank Jim.
Thank
Jim.
You.
I'm going to speak for you and say that maybe you're here for a few more minutes if people have questions that they
absolutely.
haven't been able to ask, because I know there's at least one out in the audience. But there's an opportunity to ask more questions or have more conversations about this at Eastern Divide this afternoon at 6:30. So we would love to see as many of you out there as we can. I'm happy to drive, folks, so if you need a lift, just catch me here. But thank you all so much for coming. This was